For antiwar.com and Chaos Radio 95.9 in Austin, Texas, I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. Time for our next guest, Grant F. Smith. Go to original.antiwar.com/Smith-Grant. And, or in fact, you just go to antiwar.com, look at the front of the page there. As soon as you're done donating, wink, wink, you can look in the viewpoint section. We're running Grant's article today. It's called Declassified GAO Report Exposes Fatally Flawed Israel Investigations by Grant F. Smith. Welcome back to the show. Grant, how are you?
Hey, Scott. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, I appreciate it. Everybody, if you go look at Amazon.com, you'll see that Grant... who is the founder, I believe, of the Institute for Research, Middle East Policy, IRMEP.org, has written a great many books, including Spy Trade, How Israel's Lobby Undermines America's Economy, Foreign Agents, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, from the 1963 Fulbright hearings to the 2005 espionage scandal, and America's Defense Line, the Justice Department's battle to register the Israel lobby as agents of a foreign government, Deadly Dogma, how everything is the neocons' fault, et cetera, like that. It's really great stuff. And again, it's IRMEP.org for Grant's site, the Institute for Research, Middle East Policy. Okay, now let's talk about a declassified...
Scott, no, hang on just a second. Yeah, I just wanted to say, you mentioned all those books, but people who are anti-war supporters, just to mention it, I mean, that site, and you guys are kind enough to publish what will be basically chapters in upcoming books. So I recommend people keep their donations going to anti-war so that those chapters can keep appearing there before they go to print.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. And in fact, we can split the difference here, too. If you go to antiwar.com and you look for the Amazon logo, if you just click there and you get to the Amazon site from that link from antiwar.com, then anything you buy from amazon.com, we get a cut. And then everybody's happy.
All righty.
And it is fund drive time. For those of you who just listen to the show and don't check the page regularly, it's fundraising week at antiwar.com, and we do need your help. So there's that. And thanks again, Grant.
Yeah, people got to do it.
Okay, so now there's been a report about Israel stealing something important from the United States that's been secret since I was 2 years old, and now you got your hands on it. What's it say?
Yeah, it's all about something called uranium-235.
Oh, don't tell me weapons-grade uranium-235.
My goodness, yes, Scott. And so, it may be 32 years old, but, the half-life on 235 is something like 713 million years. So, comparatively, it's still important given, what this stuff can do.
Mm-hmm. So now, it's an open secret where all 6 billion people on Earth know that Israel has nuclear weapons, but we all pretend they don't. But what most people really don't know, they don't have to pretend they don't know this. What they really don't know is that the Israelis stole their weapons-grade uranium from the United States of America.
Right. I mean, I think that's the biggest point that comes out of this investigation. Americans are hearing the Israel lobby beat the drums of war to attack Iran. You do that on your show. Other people obviously talk about it indirectly. But is what we're really being asked to protect Israel's nuclear weapons program, which is, partially based on technologies and materials stolen from U.S. taxpayers? I mean, doesn't that kind of complete a circle that taxpayers should be aware of? And isn't that worth discussing? Because, another part of the whole argument for attacking Iran, which doesn't apparently have weapons, is that there could be a future potential diversion threat. Well, the question is, who's really diverting uranium? Who? And the answer that this report, in combination with information that came out after, really points the finger to Israel as a diversion problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure what happened. I just realized, Grant, that I quit John M. Cole's book halfway through for some reason. I must have picked up a different book and forgot all about it. I got to get him back on the show, but I interviewed him in conjunction with Sibel Edmonds on the show here. Mm-hmm. I think it was. And John M. Cole told me, he was a counterintelligence agent in the FBI, and he said that he knew of at least 150 separate counterintelligence investigations, counterespionage investigations into the Israelis' activity, the not Israeli citizens, Israeli government agents' activities in the United States of America that went nowhere. And those were just the ones that he knew about, and I don't think that what he was talking about goes back to 1978.
No, this is a really interesting aspect to the whole thing. I mean, the GAO report, which we really should talk about at some point, is but one little piece. The majority of information that Americans should now have access to under the Freedom of Information Act and mandatory disclosure reviews would certainly cover all of those investigations. The fact that there are 150 either FBI counterintelligence or CIA reports or files on that sort of activity really reveals just how little we actually know about all of this. But you've got to really think about, why is it that in particular documents about the Israeli nuclear program are kept so secret? I mean, one was released to the National Security Archive here at George Washington University in town a few years ago. It was from something like 1960, and they were apoplectic. They were saying, "Oh wow, we got something finally." But that would have, it didn't even really mention stockpiles at that time, of course. But all of this stuff is secret, and if you take it through the logical, reasoning, why is it that a U.S. government has to keep documents like that secret? And my real theory is, if you think about it, put it in context, presidents come and go. The lobby's been there for a long time in many different forms, but if they're actually stealing these secrets and absolutely pilfering high technology and national defense information on an ongoing fashion, it really begs the question, why isn't the government doing anything about it? And if they did start releasing all of those documents and letting Americans know what's been going on, it would beg the question, why aren't you doing anything about this? And I think that's the thing nobody wants to talk about. The last time we spoke, we were talking about the diplomatic, row or row, I forget, between the administration and Israel over Jerusalem. That's supposedly papered over. Elie Wiesel had lunch with Obama. Martin Indyk is saying that Obama needs to go over and charm the Israelis now, but I really think he ought to do something different. He ought to get a top-secret briefing from the FBI and CIA on Israeli diversions, and he should say, declassify this stuff as much as possible, and then he should turn around and say to the Israelis, I find it in our interest here in the United States that you give us back all of the stolen material as part of our drive to denuclearize the Middle East. I mean, that's what it would imply to have that kind of information out.
Oh man, that's so funny. Just to imagine the scene. It's like a Boondocks cartoon strip, maybe. But it's sort of like we were talking about with Will Potter earlier about these communication management units, these lockdown prisons for political prisoners in the United States, where, boy, we sure have gone pretty far down this road already, and we wonder how we got here. And this is one of those things where, as you have covered in such detail, the Israeli government has been getting away with such blue bloody murder in this country for so long, from the attack on the USS Liberty, stealing nuclear material, sitting there cheering while they watched the tower get hit by planes when they clearly had not passed on what they knew about the hijackers to the American police, etc. And yet, if Obama did what you say and just declassified everything and whatever, we're so far down this road, I don't even know if anybody would be outraged anymore. I mean, just think of, your kind of imaginary little scenario there just paints the picture of what a different reality it would be, where a president would speak that frankly about Israel and would have policies about Israel that are based on, reality. For example, the kind of backlash that you would expect from the American people if they knew all the stuff that you're trying to tell them. But I just wonder whether anybody even cares anymore, No,
I think they do care, and I don't think it would be outrage. I mean, really, I think, this stuff has been written about, and it's been quite popular even. When Leonard Slater wrote his book, 1971, The Pledge, which talked about all of the conventional weapons that were diverted from the United States to Israel when it was fighting for its war of independence, people were titillated by it. It didn't really change that much because it was one book, and then it was followed by a lot of presidential pardons for some of the people involved who were convicted of felonies but never went to prison. So I wouldn't expect an immediate groundswell. But the problem is the Obama administration, or at least seems to want to engage the Arab world and have productive relations with Iran, and everyone is coming back and saying, well, we know about all of this stuff. We may not know the details, but it's in the background of everything, that you guys have supplied the Israelis with nuclear technologies. They're armed to the teeth. They've got conventional, Dolphin submarines patrolling the Persian Gulf with nuclear missiles. We've got to be able to talk about this to have any meaningful negotiations. If you read Getting the Yes or any of the negotiation books, you got to lay some truths on the table. And by not being able to do that, the Obama administration is not only a disservice to the people at the UN trying to negotiate, but it's also a big lie, a massive lie to the American people. I mean, when Helen Thomas asked her famous question about which country possesses weapons in the Middle East, and Obama started stammering and looking at his shoes, I mean, she asked it. It was his first question. That is the question. It's still the question, and they have to answer it.
And now the GAO, for people not familiar, that's the General Accounting Office. I guess they call it the General Accountability Office now. And it's basically the auditing house of the Congress. They work directly for the Congress, not under the executive branch. And, a lot of what they do is very flawed. But then again, they're probably, as far as institutionally speaking, especially now that there's no more independent counsel statute or anything, they're the closest thing to any kind of real inspector general or internal affairs type, check and balance inside this government. They're the last place where Congress can actually check the executive, basically. And so here the subject is a GAO report from 1978 that's been kept secret this whole time. And so now take us through this report. What all did you learn in this thing, Grant?
Yeah, and just getting back to that, the GAO originally wanted this report to be public, but basically the Congress was getting a lot of heat from the public, such that the chairman of the Energy Committee, Representative John Dingell, finally, he responded, and he told the GAO they wanted a complete report on an incident that happened in the early 60s at the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Company in Pennsylvania. There were 4 theories about something bad that had happened at the plant, and so they chartered the GAO to do an investigation into what actually happened. And there were 4 key theories, but basically the Israelis had obtained weapons-grade uranium in coordination with NUMEC's management for diversion to the Israeli nuclear weapons program. But the GAO was also looking into the possibilities that not only was the CIA involved, but that also whether or not the FBI or other elements of the U.S. government had engaged in a cover-up of the incident, because, basically 11 and 12 years had passed, and nothing was going on. There was not a peep from the administration about the problem. And so basically they went into this long investigation in which they found many curious things. But the most curious thing they found was that although the FBI was on to NUMEC early on, after following around Zalman Shapiro, the head of the president of the plant, and others for a while, they made a recommendation that the entire plant stop receiving uranium. The FBI recommended that NUMEC's operating license be taken away, etc. And when they were told no, the FBI walked away from the investigation between 1969 and 1976. So basically, the report's really critical of the FBI, but they're most critical about the fact that the FBI didn't investigate diversion of uranium from the beginning, as they were required to do under some laws in place at that time. Well, basically what you have is this huge gap in time where the official government line was that they didn't think there had been any diversion. And then along comes Gerald Ford, stumbling into office, probably not having been briefed on any of the skeletons in the closet of the Johnson and Nixon administration, who directly orders the FBI and Department of Justice to address the diversion aspect. Those are his words. And suddenly the investigation is back on. And suddenly U.S. government officials are changing their positions on NUMEC and saying suddenly they're reconsidering whether or not there had been a diversion of weapons-grade uranium to Israel. And the GAO then goes on to document all of the flaws of subsequent investigations, the fact that the government wasn't even really tracking any of the tons and tons of weapons-grade uranium going into NUMEC and the smaller amounts coming back out, finding that NUMEC was hiring away DOE employees who were inspecting, or AEC employees who were inspecting in a bid to kind of show that they were good guys and that they were tracking the uranium. They also mention the fact that Shapiro had friends in high places that allowed him to maintain his security clearances and continue to get sensitive jobs across the government, even if, despite the scandal. But at the end of the line, the GAO report doesn't actually say what happened to the uranium. They simply say that there doesn't appear, most in particular on the part of the CIA, to have really been any interest in resolving the NUMEC matter. That they seem to, at the very top, have been privy to feelings that this shouldn't be thoroughly investigated, and so they basically didn't do a very good job. And that's the end of the report from the GAO standpoint. Subsequent to this report, of course, we've gotten a lot more information about spies who are visiting NUMEC. There have been some books coming out, like Gideon Spies, which talk about Raphael Eaton, stealing uranium at the plant. So what it does do is it fills in sort of, what must have been going on at the top of the agencies designated with enforcing U.S. laws that caused them not to take any action on this issue, which is the big deal about this report.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you quote out of the report is the GAO investigators' speculation that perhaps this whole thing was some kind of covert op, and that at the highest levels of the U.S. government there was permission granted. Is there any indication that there's some kind of presidential finding authorizing this or something?
Well, if there is a presidential finding that authorizes the theft of taxpayer-funded weapons-grade uranium from NUMEC and indicates that the CIA should facilitate that by all means possible, haven't seen it yet. It seems because...
Would that be required, do you think? I mean, could it be, if we're talking about, I don't know, Johnson or Nixon or whatever, go ahead and let them have some. I mean, does it have to be written on paper like that in somebody's safe somewhere?
Oh, who knows? But I tend to think the following probably happened. This investigation was really shut down during the Johnson administration. And Johnson was basically so dependent on Abraham Feinberg and the good graces of the Israel lobby to finance his campaign. I would tend to think that when J. Edgar Hoover or Nicholas Katzenbach came into his office, and both of these people had been utterly beat up by the lobby. J. Edgar Hoover had been slapped around by some Jewish agency people who were covering for the conventional arms smuggling. Katzenbach had lost a big effort to register the American Zionist Council as a foreign agent. So they come into office humbled. I can just see Johnson maybe saying or indicating by rolling his eyes, this is not going to be a big investigation priority for me, because he already told some of his staff When a defense Secretary Clark Clifford came in and phoned him and it said, quote, "Mr. President, I don't want to live in a world where the Israelis have nuclear weapons," unquote. Johnson just said, "Don't bother me with this anymore." So if he was saying, "Don't bother me with this anymore," to his law enforcement people, I would tend to think that accounts for the big gap. Whether that's a presidential director authorizing that the U.S. arm the Israelis with nuclear arms, I don't think so. Because if there were, if this were a big, long-standing, covert project to arm them, I think it would have been done differently. I don't think the Israelis would have been, sneaking around in Pennsylvania, or that David Lowenthal, who is in close contact with Israeli intelligence, would have financed the plant. I think this was an Israeli covert op that when it was the lid was blown off, I think the president found it in his interest not to do anything about it. Just another side note, this book, Israel and the Bomb, which is a great book by Avner Cohen, talks about how David Ben-Gurion arranged with Abraham Feinberg, who is a big Democratic fundraiser, that he should, he was going to be one of the people financing the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Ben-Gurion told him, according to this book, to, basically get that youngster Kennedy back on board, that he shouldn't be making all these moves to inspect Dimona, blah, blah, blah. And he was really, Feinberg was the point man for getting this thing financed and keeping the heat off it. He was an incredibly powerful person right in the heart of the administration. Now, again, whether he was passing around papers saying, "Hey, my boss in Tel Aviv has told me to make sure that we get this uranium one way or the other," I kind of doubt it. I kind of think this is much more subtle than that.
Who is or who are MEGA? Do you know?
No, I haven't gotten that file yet. I don't even know who to send a FOIA to. Do you?
No. I mean, I guess I always just assume it was Henry Kissinger or something, but what the hell do I know?
Yeah.
Well, can you tell us anything about MEGA? Who's MEGA for people who never heard of him or them?
MEGA is the spy who was picked up on some sort of tap between two Israelis who were talking about some problem. And they said, "Well, maybe we should give this to MEGA." And the other one said, "No, be quiet. We don't use MEGA for that." And I think that was in the context of something having to do with the 67 war. I forget the exact content. But it was obviously referring to somebody high up in U.S. officialdom who was in a position to pull strings.
I was thinking it was in the 1980s or something, that it was more recent than that. Well, I know, let's see. The first report of it that I know of was something that Bamford unearthed from the NSA that was published in, I think, 87 or something. But I don't know how old the information was that it was referring to.
Yeah. I'm not up on that. I don't have any FOIAs out on that, but basically, yeah, you're right.
Shoot, I got Google right in front of me here. You talk and I'll search for the date.
Okay. Yeah, I think you are right. I think it did refer to something more recent. I think I got the conversation right, but basically, other theories were that it might be our favorite Israeli ambassador, Brookings Institution, naturalized U.S. citizen Martin Indyk. But I don't like speculating about who the spies are. I'd rather get files saying who they are. It's much more entertaining. Of course, much more challenging as well. One of the things that's interesting, though, getting back to the GAO document, is that it really does show via the GAO that there really was no will to investigate. And so, that you have to follow all the way up the line from all the agencies involved. And what you basically have is going to the top of the FBI, the top of the CIA, an unwillingness of the president to pursue this. And the fact, again, that Ford was the one who reinitiated it, kind of tend to think that maybe he did that out of ignorance. So what did you find?
Well, I keep finding the quote here, and it was in 1997, not 87, that the Washington Post published the quote, and you paraphrased it pretty much perfectly here, but I don't see the, let's see, the exact quote. This is not something we use mega for, if people want to Google that. I don't see anybody saying the date of the intercept so far here. Yeah, well, just the fact that there's such a person as Mega that we don't use for stuff like this, who's apparently never been prosecuted. This guy, Ben Ami Kaddish, nobody seems to think that he was Mega. I mean, whoever this Mega is, he's either in the U.S. or in Israel right now, sipping tea, right?
Right, and I think that's, part of the problem. Jonathan Pollard was a low-level guy. Another person, Edward Smith, who is finally did some time for trafficking in some nuclear triggers, ran overseas for 11 years before he came back and finally went to jail. But the big fish in that case, who was a big Hollywood producer, never went to prison, never even spent a day in court over that. So what we have in the United States is really an elite level, and this goes all the way back to the smuggling days of the Sonneborn network, when they were moving tanks and stolen 50 caliber machine guns from under the noses of Marine guards over to Palestine to fight. All of the big funders of this kind of illegal activity enjoy a level of prosecutorial immunity that I don't think has ever occurred in any country, with the exception of Sicily and Italy, and the mafia. It's absolutely astounding. If you look at all that's been accomplished that was blatantly illegal, that really wouldn't matter if a president had signed a piece of paper, because basically his only job is to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the land, as far as I know.
Well, the problem with that is that includes the National Security Act of 1947 that says he can direct the CIA to do things if they feel like it or something.
Well,
he can do whatever he wants.
You're right on that point. The
Yeah.
CIA
but no,
has
you're right about the level of absolute impunity going on here, and it's worse than the British leading up to World War II in terms of infiltration by a foreign government of this government. And it's like Harry Brown always said, it ain't the abuse of power, it's the power to abuse. This is what we get for being a world empire. We got a tiny little nation state the size of Maryland over there, jerking us around, stealing our nuclear material, lying us into war, and getting away with 100% of it.
That's what people should be mad about, and that's one of the reasons why I disagree with people who say this lobby is American as apple pie. The people at the bottom who are donating and maybe doing some political work are as American as apple pie, but the leadership is rotten to the core, and it's been attacking this country from within for so many years. I mean, basically, the files I've been able to get under FOIA, whether it's the economic espionage that was happening in the 80s, whether it's a more recent case with Rosen and Weissman, everything that they've been doing has not been as American as apple pie. It's been attempting to get this country into another war. It's been stealing basically from American industry by diverting trade in ways that are certainly not free trade but are unhealthy, and securing privileges for their foreign principals. And they refuse to declare at the upper levels of the lobby. We tried back in the 60s, but they refuse to declare that they're foreign lobbyists doing what they're doing, and, the abuses are heaped upon abuses.
Yeah. Well, I guess it just should not go without being emphasized here, the story of Jane Harman, who was in line to be the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who was on the short list to be the director of the CIA, who was caught red-handed, busted, for making a corrupt deal with an agent of the Israeli government to basically try to, in a sense, blackmail or extort, I guess is more like it, Nancy Pelosi into getting her that seat as chair of the House Intelligence Committee. And, the whole way it was done was by, we threatened to withhold all California Jewish money from the Democratic Party unless you don't get this done. And the effort was to be headed up by Haim Saban. And the whole thing was not just busted open by the excellent, nobody ever questions his credentials or authoritative voice on national security issues. The great journalist Jeff Stein, who's now at the Washington Post himself, who then was at Congressional Quarterly. But it was all verified and followed up and expanded on by the New York Times and the Washington Post, both once. Both ran one story, developing the story a little bit, and then away it went. And Jane Harman is still sitting in the House of Representatives, and I don't know, how she stands in her in the current primary telephone polls or whatever leading up to her primary against Marcy Winograd, but the normal state of things is to be expected. She's going to go back to the House of Representatives as though none of this ever happened. She challenged Jeff Stein to a fund run, and the whole thing went away.
Yeah, it just shows. I mean, I ended my article saying that these things are not even investigated, much less prosecuted, because everyone's gotten the memo by now. And that memo reads, you absolutely cannot use our criminal justice system or any legal system to go after these abuses. And speaking of that race, there's a great article by Jeffrey Blankford called The Last Democratic Primary Worth Watching, because what you say, that race will determine if, in fact, Winograd can even get her message out, whether, the American people are willing to vote for somebody who's honest versus somebody who's working for a foreign government on important matters. So,
me, I'm a libertarian, and I'm against everything, whatever it is, I'm against it, and whatever Marcy Winograd's positions on various issues are, they don't necessarily have anything to do with me, but anyone can look at those two women, just glance at the two of them. One of them is clearly a villain, and the other is a sweet lady. You know what I mean? There's just no question about that. Nancy Harman is a mean old witch, and Marcy Winograd is not. And, never mind even the details. That's how Americans choose these things, is like it's an American Idol contest. Well, if that's so, then Marcy Winograd ought to do great. Because that Jane Harman is just, the worst.
Well, it just gets back into the nature of politics. I mean, again, going back to Abraham Feinberg, the reason he was so valuable to the Israeli nuclear program was that he was just at the heart of Democratic Party fundraising. I'm sure there's a Republican equivalent, but, that's not the way our politics should be run. George Washington never imagined it to be that way, I'm sure. But, getting back
Well, he did imagine it, and he warned specifically against it. He said, this is exactly what will happen to you. Let me describe it. And then he went on in detail in his farewell address. Once you put your interests and intertwine them all with those of a foreign power, this is what will happen to you. And he, might as well have gone ahead and described the Jane Harman incident word for word there.
Yeah, pretty much. And, this is it. This is the job for Americans. Americans who are troubled by this whole drive to get Iran. I mean, Michael Schroyer wrote an intro to my last book, and he quoted Lincoln saying, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. And that's what's happening. I mean, as a nation of free men, we can either, and women, decide that, the Jane Harmans of the world and the Haim Sabans, that they're the ones who should really be running things, or that other people who aren't doing that sort of thing should be in charge and, pull the right levers in the voting booth, insist that the attorneys, the district attorneys, go after violations. I mean, in the last election, Haim Saban was offering $1 million to electors to throw their vote to Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's clearly a major election violation. The people who were asked to do that made loud noises about how improper that was. What happened? Nothing.
Well, of course, if he'd been Chinese, people would have flipped out, right? It's no different,
think of
really.
His last name were Abu Haj.
You're right, yeah, or Riyadi.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the Chinese. That Lippo Bank, which is basically a half partnership between the Riyadi family and the People's Liberation Army, they paid for 3 elections of Bill Clinton's, his second governor's race or his third, maybe it was 4, 2 governor's races and 2 presidential races bankrolled by the Chinese. And finally, at least, that caught on because they look different than us, I guess, or different enough that people were able to make hay about it, but it's really no different in kind than what's going on here.
And we shouldn't care. We should care about the corruption. And, the point here is the corruption is coming from this lobby right now, and it's pervasive, it's dangerous, it's misdirecting our national wealth. People really have to take note. Otherwise, as Bush said one time during the financial crisis, this sucker could go down.
Yep. And you know what always confused me, too? The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I mean, I was too old by the time that thing came out, but I think even if I had been 8, I would have thought that was cheesy and stupid.
Well, you're onto something there as well. The idea, again, that Haim Saban can put, $13 million into the Brookings Institution and bring in his guy, Martin Indyk, to tell us about progressive policy, and that he can also put an almost equal amount into the Democratic National Committee to influence the Clinton administration and get his people into government. I mean, we should be somewhat suspicious and say, where is this money coming from? Because in the case of Feinberg, he would be moving, hundreds of thousands of dollars around while the Israeli government would be giving him concessions. And we see kind of that same thing happening in the case of Nosetti, it's alleged, and his indictments. We see it in the same case with other people who have business interests overseas, and there's no apparent foreign agency connection. Yet, when you see the cash flow, you say, oh, I see, they're a foreign agent, this is a foreign influence. Whoever they're working for, it's not the American people, so we should shut it down. So I have a real problem with the way some of these financial arrangements are made, because what I've seen over the years is that the foreign agent registration section of the DOJ has been pretty much shut down. They can't take on this stuff. They've been beaten to a pulp, and they're not protecting the American people anymore. So
yeah, that's the thing about slippery slopes. You end up at the bottom of it, where the FBI ain't even trying anymore.
Nope.
Great.
Nope.
Yeah. Well, so much for them anyway. All right. Well, listen.
It'd be nice if they did something good.
Yeah. No, seriously. I think if we abolished the FBI and just turned it over to the state police departments, they'd do better. If it came down to it, Well, I prefer the Texas Rangers.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Listen, I really appreciate your time as always, Grant. Great work.
Thanks for having me on. Anytime.
All right, y'all. That is Grant F. Smith from the Institute for Research, Middle East Policy. That's IRMEP, I-R-M-E-P, IRMEP.org. He's the author of Spy Trade, Foreign Agents, Deadly Dogma, America's Defense Line, Visa Denied, and I guess that's it. All right. Anti-War Radio.